Greetings, everyone. Hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. Last week, I had the opportunity to play through Sovereign Syndicate, and it was a really interesting experience. So I'm looking forward to providing this review for all of you. First and foremost, let me just get it out the way because I know my community and I know what games they have played. Yes, this game bears a lot of similarities to Disco Elysium, but in my opinion, that's not a bad thing. That's actually great company to be in. And even more importantly, this game does enough to distinguish itself from that experience and come across as a wholly unique property that was definitely worth playing through. Part of the reason for that is the absolutely fantastic world building that has been done. The game is mainly focused in London and it leans heavily into fantasy elements. So you see creatures walking around, owning stores, and talking to other NPCs that you usually wouldn't see in games, such as centaurs, cyclopses, minotaurs, and even large cows. Really cool stuff and makes just walking around in London feel very unique. And this distinction isn't just visual because the game has some absolutely fantastic writing. So these characters that you meet, a lot of times they have their own backgrounds and stories and perspectives that are based around their particular race. So you could talk to a werewolf who has to chain himself up every time a full moon comes out in order to ensure that no one is harmed by his actions. Or the Cyclops who has to deal with the racism from other creatures because they cannot believe how much wealth he has been able to generate. A lot of the backstory that you hear does so much to make the characters that you meet even more colorful. Absolutely great stuff. Throughout the game, you take control of 3 characters, and each one of these characters has their own personal story, and then they also have a part in the main overarching story, which is a mystery regarding women that are being randomly murdered throughout the city. Each of these separate characters has their own backstory, their own personality, and their own motivations for doing certain things throughout the game. Each of them also has their own set of internal voices. And of course, this system will be very familiar to those of you who have played through Disco Elysium. Basically, all 3 of the characters have different voices or aspects of their personality that speak to them during conversations. For example, the Minotaur has animal instinct, and this is basically telling him at all times you can resolve this issue physically, and it's also always telling him to give in to his vices. So as an alcoholic, he should be drinking all the liquor that he possibly can, doing any drugs that come his way, and just in general taking whatever he wants. On the flip side, you can also take control of a human, and one of her internal voices is tact, which is constantly telling her the best thing to say in a particular situation in order to get people on her side or just naturally blend into the environment. Leaning into that voice is of course going to provide you with a very different experience than what you're going to get with the Minotaur leaning into animal instinct. The first 3 chapters each have you take control of a different party member. And at the beginning of the chapter, you're going to be able to choose an archetype. The archetype is going to provide a permanent bonus to 3 of your skills, which are essentially your internal voices, and it's going to give you a trait, which is going to unlock specific dialogue options you otherwise would not have access to. Traits can be unlocked throughout the game based on different dialogue options that you take, and you can continue to increase skills even if they're not part of the initial skills that are increased by your archetype. But this initial selection is still very important because there's a limited amount of points to increase your skills with throughout the game. So whatever you choose for your archetype is more than likely the skills that you're going to need to stick with throughout your playthrough. When you choose a dialogue option that is connected with a specific skill, you're going to get a humor. And once you have 10 humors for a particular skill, it will increase by 1. So basically, the more you use a skill, the more it's going to increase. Sometimes you're going to have to pass a skill check in order to use a skill. And this is going to be a very familiar system for anybody who's played Baldur's Gate 3 or a similar D&D game. You're going to have to essentially pass a difficulty check, which is a certain number. There are no dice in this game, but there are cards and they serve the same function. So some cards will have you automatically fail a skill check. Others will automatically allow you to pass a skill check, and then there are ones in between that will essentially add onto whatever your skill rank currently is, and if that number is high enough, then you'll pass the check. The really cool thing about this system is that it so heavily impacts the way that you role play the game. In my first playthrough for the Minotaur, I chose Animal Instinct because I wanted to be the big hulking brute who goes around intimidating everybody, drinking beer, and just getting my way all the time. Unfortunately, the game didn't work out that way because I didn't realize there are going to be other creatures in the game that are just as big as you, and they're not going to be intimidated by you whatsoever. But still, it was a pretty fun experience. When I did a live stream of the game, I decided to go in a completely different direction. So instead, I picked the illusion archetype, which focused more so on the magician aspect of what the Minotaur can do, and it also focused on self-discipline. So taking as little liquor as possible and basically trying to wean the Minotaur off of substances. Both of these experiences felt completely different, and it really hammered home that there's a lot of replay value in this game based on how you role play the characters. The other two characters are the same way, with a plethora of different role-playing options provided in order for you to be able to create your own distinct experience. The last aspect of this game that I really like is that the vast majority of NPCs you speak with have their own portrait. I feel like this is so important for a game where the conversations are not fully animated and there's no voice acting. At least give me a portrait of the person that I'm talking with to make the experience much more immersive, and Sovereign Syndicate does a great job of that. The only caveat I will provide is that the window where you see the portrait is relatively small, so it would be nice if it was larger, such as the way it is in games like Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, where you get a really good clear view of what the character actually looks like. But still, the amount of effort that I'm sure it took to make sure all these different characters had their own portrait, I'm sure it was massive, especially for a small studio. So I really appreciate it because I think it pulls you into the game a lot more. There are a few aspects of the game that I am neutral on, starting with the fact that there is no voice acting. Now, of course, many of you who have been with the channel for a while by now know that I don't care about there being no voice acting in the game, and I have no problems reading through a bunch of text. But I also know that the vast majority of players do not feel the same way. And for some of them, a game that has no voice acting is automatically a no-go for them. So I feel like it's worth noting. I do want to say, to Sovereign Syndicate's credit, I didn't see very many times where it presented you with huge walls of text where it seemed like it was going to be a real chore to read through. Most of the time, the dialogue you're reading through, most of the time, the text you are reading through is dialogue. And again, the writing in this game is very strong. So the dialogue is fun to read as well. Again, as a person who doesn't have a problem reading dialogue, I didn't have an issue getting through the game at all. But for those of you who this is a sticking point, I definitely want to make sure I brought it up with you. The other aspect of this game that I am neutral on is the amount of load screens. There are a ton of load screens in this game. Essentially, every time you enter into a door or fast travel somewhere, you're going to encounter a load screen. But they are super fast. So it's not like you're sitting around waiting a long time for them to get through. The only time the load screens became a huge issue for me is when I wanted to fast travel and I was several levels deep into an area, because you can only fast travel when you're outside. So sometimes I would enter a place and then there was another door you need to go through. So I'll go into that door, and then there's another door you need to go into. So you go into that door and then you do what you need to do. And then I'm like, okay, I want to fast travel, but now I have to go back through all those doors and go through all those load screens before I can finally fast travel to where I want to get to. So that happened a couple of times. That was irritating, but otherwise the load screens aren't that big of a deal because they go by so fast, but it does give a kind of pace to the game where it's like start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, because you are pretty much constantly encountering them. The last aspect of this game that I'm neutral on is that it is very slow. There's virtually no combat in this game, and even when you do have combat, it's not really a knuckle gripping, I don't know if I'm going to get through this type of affair, right? It's all narrative, and you know you're going to get on the other side of it and then just continue on with the story. So the vast majority of this game is focused on character development, dialogue, world building, things of that nature. So for me, that's great because that's all the stuff that I really love and that matters the most to me in a game. But for those of you who are looking for more of a bang bang shoot 'em up type of affair, obviously this is not really going to give you that type of experience. All right, now it's time to get into what I dislike about the game. But before we do that, if you enjoy this review, I would really appreciate it if you went ahead and clicked the like button. It lets me know what content the channel is enjoying, and it really helps out the channel. So if you've been enjoying this, please do me a favor, hit that button. I'd really appreciate the support. All right, getting into what I dislike about the game. First and foremost, there's a lot of backtracking. This game covers a very small space. I'd say the amount of space it is smaller than Disco Elysium, and all three characters travel through the same areas over and over again throughout the game's 18 chapters. So each chapter you'll switch to another character and then they'll walk through the 4 or 5 areas that this game has you walking through. Consequently, you're going to walk through a lot of the same areas, which very rarely look any different, and you're going to have to talk to the same people over and over again throughout the game. Now, again, the writing in this game is fantastic. And all three characters are very distinctive. They have different internal voices. So it's not like this content necessarily feels the same. But by the middle of the game, it definitely started to wear on me. And this is going to sound bad, but honestly, it kind of reminded me of Dragon Age 2. For those people who have played that game, it had to recycle a lot of the same areas that you walk through or that you fight through throughout your experience. It's not quite as bad here because Sovereign Syndicate is a shorter game. And obviously it's an indie studio, so I understand this is their first shot, and hopefully things will be a little bit different in the sequel. But definitely, the lack of different areas to explore was a noticeable issue. Another aspect of the game I didn't like is that at least in my playthrough, it didn't seem like I could really fail. I never got to the point where I was like, man, I'm not sure what's going to happen if I can't do this dialogue sequence properly. Or, man, I'm in this combat scenario and I feel like if I say the wrong thing or if I'm not able to pass this check, the consequences could be really, really disastrous. I never felt that way in the game. And I definitely believe in a narrative experience like this, they need to find a way to make the narrative more gripping, where you really, really feel like, hey, if this goes wrong, it could be really bad for me. In Disco Elysium, it was very easy to die. You make the wrong dialogue choice or you kick the wrong mailbox and all of a sudden your character kills over and you have to load up again. That's not the way it is in Sovereign Syndicate at all. And I'm the type of player who, by the end of the game, I want to feel like the ending that I got took some degree of skill to get, or at least it's representative of how much I explored all the different quests and completed all of the content. And I didn't really feel that way. By the end, I felt like, okay, this was kind of going to happen no matter what, even though that's not necessarily true because there are multiple endings to the game. So there probably is some degree of failure that's possible, but it never felt that way. I never felt like there was any real danger. And so I think that's definitely something that would have to improve in a sequel. And then the last aspect of the game that I did not care for is there was no camaraderie between the three characters that I controlled. I kept waiting for that moment when all three of them would come into a room and shake hands and say, okay, we're all trying to resolve this mystery and we're all going to work together to make this happen. That actually never occurs. And honestly, depending on some of your choices, a couple of the characters might flat out despise each other. And while that is a unique experience, right? I'm all about developers providing the player with something that they haven't experienced before. So controlling all three of these characters who are in a lot of ways disconnected and barely know each other for an entire game, it's different. But I didn't care for it. I don't like it. I'm all about party-based games. I'm all about the party being together. Even if everybody doesn't love each other and doesn't necessarily get along well, at least we should know each other and come to an understanding that, hey, we're going to get this particular task done. And that never happens in Sovereign Syndicate. And it was odd to me, especially by the time I got almost to the end and I realized, oh, okay, this moment is never going to happen. They're never going to, come to one accord. I'm just controlling all these people kind of separately for the entire experience. It was odd. It felt very odd. And I definitely would like to see that changed in a potential sequel. And that's it. Those are all the thoughts that I have regarding Sovereign Syndicate. Once again, I had a great time with the game. I thought the writing was fantastic. The character development, it was a joy. Controlling all three of them, exploring the world was fantastic. I love seeing Cyclopses and Centaurs everywhere I go. Just really, really cool stuff. There is, of course, the issue for some players that there's no voice acting, there's very little combat, it is slow. This is a game that's really about being a character study. So if you love those kind of games, which I do, especially if you're a fan of games like Disco Elysium, I absolutely recommend that you give this a shot. And just in general, even if this game doesn't appeal to you that much, sometimes I buy a game even when I don't plan to play it. I appreciate developers who try to provide a unique experience. And that's the way I look at this. As a really, really unique experience, there aren't 20 other games out that are trying to do the same thing. And so I appreciate developers, especially in these times where it seems like studios are shutting down left and right. People are being laid off left and right. I really, really want to reward the developers who take the time to try to do something unique and not just try to put out what they feel will turn out the quickest buck. That's my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments. If you played this game, how did you feel about it? Did you feel like this review lined up with your thoughts? If you haven't played the game, how did you feel about the review? Are there still questions that you have? Is this a game you would want to purchase? Or you feel like this is a game you probably wouldn't enjoy? Looking forward to hearing all of your feedback, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.